The moment those Maxwell deposition pages hit the open air, Buckingham Palace didn't roar, it vanished. No statement, no carefully worded denial, no polite royal eyebrow raise. Just that icy, surgical silence that only shows up when people inside the walls think this could burn down the whole story we sold the world. Because the chatter wasn't about a messy headline anymore. It wasn't about a bad week or bad optics. It was about a chain reaction, names, circles, access, timelines, colliding into one nightmare question the palace never once asked out loud. If Prince Andrew's shadow is on this, who else is standing in it? And why does Meghan's missing timeline suddenly feel like a locked room? And here's what makes this story feel like a pressure bomb. The way everything allegedly snapped into place all at once. A supposed list of high status figures linked to royal adjacent circles. The idea of 8 other royals. The whisper that this isn't random gossip, but something open, something forensic, something heavy enough to crush reputations by sheer association. Whether it's true, partially true, or internet-fueled hysteria, one thing is obvious, the palace treated it like a live wire. And when the palace gets scared, it doesn't scream. It locks doors. Inside those walls, the story goes zero trust mode, slammed into place. Suddenly, the vibe becomes no back and forth, no soft family diplomacy, no let's talk. The narrative paints Prince William as the cold operator in this moment, someone who doesn't argue with a threat, he contains it. Communication to Montecito, cut. Not debated, cut. And across the ocean, the Montecito atmosphere, again, according to this narrative, shifts in a way you can feel even without cameras. Prince Harry pacing like someone watching sand pour out of the hourglass and realizing he can't turn it over. Because suddenly his old question, why did the palace hate her, morphs into the far uglier one, what did they see that I didn't? That's the emotional center of this whole thing. Not jewels, not yachts, not tabloids. A man looking back and wondering if the fairy tale was never a fairy tale, if it was a pathway, a pipeline, a placement. Now listen, this is where the story gets weaponized in gossip circles, because it leans into the part the public can't easily verify, those missing years. That fuzzy stretch where timelines are soft and memories get selective and photos pop up in places they shouldn't. The transcript style narrative frames a 2013-2016 like a fog bank, blurry enough for anything to hide inside it. And it points to the same theme over and over, access. Not Hollywood auditions, not steady career steps, access. Elite cities, elite parties, elite corridors where people glide in and out without leaving fingerprints. Istanbul, Phuket, St. Bart's, the Riviera, the yacht circuit. Places where privacy isn't a preference, it's a purchase service. The narrative isn't subtle about the implication. A cable actress budget doesn't easily translate into first-class miles, yacht decks, and luxury backdrops that look like a billionaire's screensaver. So, Gossip Logic does what Gossip Logic always does. It asks who paid, who sponsored, who opened the door, who made the introductions. And then it names the alleged mechanism Soho House. Not as a cute members club, not as a trendy creative hangout, but as a velvet filter where the ambitious are selected, polished, and placed close to power. A system that doesn't just network, it routes people. And hovering over that is a single name the narrative keeps bringing back like a recurring ghost, Marcus. Not framed as a buddy. Not framed as a casual friend. Framed as the gatekeeper, tables, introductions, SUVs, quiet arrangements, secret dinners, the invisible hand that makes chance meetings feel a little too perfectly timed. So now gossip minds go into overdrive. If there really were 8 royal adjacent names floating in the same luxury ecosystem, then the terrifying possibility becomes not scandal, but intersection. A brush by, a party photo, a shared guest list. One overlap is all it takes for the palace to fear a contamination effect. Because monarchy isn't just tradition, it's brand, legitimacy, continuity. And nothing threatens that like whispers of hidden networks and compromised access. But the most dangerous part of the story isn't even the cities or the club, it's the sparkle. Because the narrative introduces a kind of currency that doesn't require bank statements, jewelry. Specifically, the earrings that gossip culture loves to treat like receipts you can wear. The story claims the timeline around them bends, borrowed, gifted, re-explained, like someone trying to smooth over a wrinkle that won't iron out. And the reason gossip loves gems is simple: diamonds don't speak, but they suggest. They sit on on your skin like a quiet signature. And once people believe a jewel predates the official story, they start asking the kind of questions that make PR teams sweat through silk. But if those earrings existed in her orbit earlier than claimed, who put them there and why? Now, the Andrew angle, already toxic on its own, gets dragged into the same mental map. The narrative claims that what once looked like separate branches of royal embarrassment starts to feel eerily adjacent when you force the circles to overlap. It even frames Meghan's past statements about barely knowing Andrew as something that wobbles under the weight of social orbit logic. If you move through certain elite ecosystems, how do you never brush the man who's infamous for living in them? And this is where the story turns William into the rumored guardian of the gate, allegedly reviewing some kind of private dossier when Harry announced the relationship was serious. Not jealousy, not snobbery. A warning delivered in that royal way, calm voice, sharp message. Don't rush this. Because if the palace believed, even for a second, that the woman marrying into the institution came with unspoken attachments, hidden patrons, or compromised associations, then the wedding wasn't romance. It was risk. And in this narrative, Harry is the tragic center of it, a man convinced he was rescuing a misunderstood woman from a cold machine, only to wake up one day and realize the machine might have been protecting itself from something he didn't understand. So when the Maxwell names storyline blows up online, it's not just scandal gossip, it's a panic signal. Because the palace can survive messy interviews, it can survive angry books, it can survive Hollywood tantrums, but it cannot survive the suggestion, true or not, that royal proximity brushed against something criminal, shadowy, or networked. That's when palaces don't argue. They extract, they isolate, they separate the asset from the fire. And according to the narrative you've given, that extraction plan is already forming. Because once the palace flips from defensive to protective, the tone changes everywhere. The air stiffens, smiles flatten, doors that were once politely ajar shut without a sound. And in this story, that shift didn't begin with a press leak, it began with internal fear. Fear that the problem wasn't what Meghan said after marrying in. Fear that the problem was everything before. That's why, according to this narrative, aides stopped asking questions that required answers and started asking questions that required containment. Who knew whom? Who introduced whom? Who vouched? Who insisted? Who waved off concerns with she's clean, she's ambitious, she's harmless? Because ambition, when paired with access, can look harmless right up until it isn't. And here's the part gossip culture latches on to hardest. The idea that Meghan didn't accidentally land where she landed. That she didn't stumble into royalty like a rom-com heroine tripping over fate. That she moved with intent, testing circles, refining her image, shedding skins until she fit the room she wanted to enter. Actress, activist, insider, fiance, duchess. Each phase snapping into place like a ladder built rung by rung. The story frames it as social engineering, not seduction. And once that idea takes hold, everything she does retroactively changes meaning. The voice, the interviews, the calculated vulnerability, the tear that lands exactly when it should, the speech that always centers her, the way every setback becomes a moral crusade, not random, strategic. Which brings us to the point where Harry, in this telling, finally breaks, not publicly, but internally. Because imagine waking up inside a life you burned bridges to defend, only to sense that the people you accused of cruelty might have been practicing restraint. Imagine replaying every warning you brushed aside, every slowdown, every are you sure, every look exchanged behind closed doors that you interpreted as snobbery instead of concern. And suddenly the question isn't why don't they like her? It's why were they afraid? That's where the lawsuits start to feel different. The relentless need to litigate, to expose, to force apologies, to rewrite history under oath. The narrative paints it as desperation disguised as justice, a man trying to control the story before the story controls him. Because once legal proceedings start, discovery isn't a sword, it's a mirror. And mirrors are dangerous when your past has blind spots. So when whispers circulate that certain names, royal adjacent, not front-facing, appear in uncomfortable proximity to darker networks, the palace allegedly doesn't panic outward. It panics inward. It tightens protocols. It limits contact. It avoids situations where casual overlap could later be reframed as complicity. This is why, in this story, William becomes ice, not cruel, calculated. Because from his vantage point, the monarchy isn't a family, it's a structure. A 1,000-year-old institution held together by perception. And perception doesn't need proof to collapse, it only needs doubt. That's why reconciliation suddenly disappears from the table. Not because Harry wrote a book, not because Meghan did an interview, but because the risk profile changed. The narrative suggests the palace began treating the Sussexes not as wayward relatives, but as liabilities with microphones. And Meghan, always acutely aware of optics, senses it. She senses the freeze, the silence, the invitations that never arrive, the calls that don't return, the realization that she's no longer being resisted, she's being excluded. And that's when the pivot happens. The brand intensifies, the victim narrative sharpens, the language becomes more absolute. Racism, cruelty, abuse. Because if you can't regain access, you must dominate the story from the outside. You must become too loud to ignore, too moral to challenge, too wounded to question. But here's the irony: the gossip narrative keeps circling. The louder the accusations grow, the calmer the palace becomes. Because silence in royal logic isn't surrender, it's insulation. And behind that insulation, according to this storyline, files are being sealed. Advisors are documenting timelines. Lawyers are preparing not to fight, but to wait. Because time has a way of exposing contradictions that passion can't outrun. And Harry? He's trapped between identities. Not royal enough to be protected. Not private enough to disappear. Not powerful enough to force forgiveness. Just famous enough to burn. The narrative frames him as the last man to realize that love doesn't conquer systems, it collides with them. That marrying into the crown doesn't elevate ambition, it interrogates it. And that when you bring someone into the highest institution in the land, their past doesn't vanish. It multiplies. So when online speculation flares again, names, lists, networks, associations, the palace doesn't respond because it doesn't need to. The people who matter already understand the difference between denial and distance. Distance is the message. No balcony, no Christmas walk, no casual lunch, no soft leaks of reconciliation, just absence. And absence in royal terms is final, which leaves Meghan with the one thing she's always mastered: performance without proximity, narrative without access, power without permission. But the gossip world is ruthless. Because once the spell cracks, the same audience that applauded the ascent begins scanning the climb for scaffolding. Who helped? Who arranged? Who smoothed edges? Who financed movement? Who vouched credibility that didn't yet exist? And if even one of those answers overlaps with something darker, something society doesn't forgive, then the fairy tale doesn't just end. It inverts. From misunderstood outsider to calculated climber. From victim to question mark. And that's the danger point the palace fears most. Not scandal, reinterpretation. Because history doesn't need a verdict to change. It only needs a new lens. And once people start asking how someone arrived somewhere instead of why they were mistreated once there, the story is already slipping out of your control. Which is why the doors stay closed. Which is why the silence stays firm. And which is why, if this narrative is even half true, the real reckoning hasn't happened yet. It's only waiting for the moment when the past stops being background and becomes the headline.